If Queen Sofia of Spain is famous for her gentleness, her own mother, Queen Friederike of Greece, was infamous for her cruelty. She holds a chilling distinction in history. She is arguably the only queen of a major European nation to have worn the uniform of the Hitler Youth. With German blood in her veins and brothers who were SS officers, Friederike ruled the Greek palace less like a home and more like a military barracks. Winston Churchill called her the menace. The Greek people flooded the streets demanding her exile. She was the nightmare mother-in-law of royal legend, the woman who suffocated her daughter-in-law Anne-Marie and broke the will of her daughter Sophia to forge a perfect instrument of power. This is the story of the most powerful yet most hated royal woman of the 20th century, a queen whose obsession with control inadvertently pushed an entire dynasty into the grave. Friederike was born on April 18, 1917 in Blankenburg, Germany. The date is crucial. She was born into the dying breaths of the German Empire. Her grandfather was Kaiser Wilhelm II, the man who had led Germany into the carnage of World War I. For most children, birth is a beginning. For Friederike, it was an ending. 7 months after she was born, the German Empire collapsed. The Kaiser was forced to abdicate and fled into exile in the Netherlands. The House of Hanover, one of the oldest and proudest dynasties in Europe, was stripped of its sovereignty. They kept their titles and their castles, but they lost their power. This is the psychological ground zero for Friederike. She grew up in a household that was essentially a mausoleum of lost glory. Her father, Ernest Augustus, Duke of Brunswick, was a bitter man. He had been a ruling duke. Now he was a private citizen in a republic he despised. The atmosphere at the dinner table was thick with resentment. The conversation did not revolve around art or literature, but around the betrayal, the stab-in-the-back myth. The idea that the German army was undefeated in the field, but betrayed by politicians, Jews, and communists at home, was the lullaby Friederike heard before she slept. She internalized a specific, dangerous lesson. Democracy is chaos. The mob is dangerous. Only a strong leader, a Kaiser, can restore order. This was not just political opinion, it was an emotional survival mechanism. As a child, she watched the Weimar Republic descend into hyperinflation. She saw the uncertainty in her parents' eyes. To a child with a naturally dominant and aggressive temperament, this instability was terrifying. She craved structure. She craved strength. And in the early 1930s, a movement arose in Germany that promised exactly that. The question of her relationship to Nitnism can't be avoided. Historians favorable to the monarchy often brush this period aside, claiming Friederike was just a child, or that her family was apolitical. The evidence suggests otherwise. The House of Hanover was not apolitical. They were fiercely anti-republican. When the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, began to rise, many German aristocrats viewed them with disdain because of their lower-class origins. Hitler was, after all, a corporer. But they also viewed them as a necessary tool, a hammer to smash communists and restore German pride. Friederike's family went further than pragmatic tolerance. Her mother, Princess Victoria Louise of Prussia, the Kaiser's only daughter, was a woman of immense pride in German nationalism. But it was her brothers Ernst and George William who were the true believers. Imagine the scene. A teenage Friederike, impressionable, intelligent, and desperate for a cause, looking up to her older brothers. They come home wearing the crisp brown uniforms. They talk about a new Germany. They talk about purity, discipline, and destiny. This was the drug Friederike had been waiting for. She joined the Bund Deutscher Mailblam.
While defenders argue membership became mandatory later, early joiners like Friederike were often motivated by genuine enthusiasm or peer pressure within their aristocratic circles. The BDM was not just a knitting circle, it was an indoctrination machine. Friederike absorbed a curriculum that demanded total obedience, racial pride, and self-sacrifice. The ideology taught that the individual does not matter, only the state matters, that she was part of a master race superior to the Slavs, the Jews, and the Southern Europeans, and that her body and life belonged to the Führer. It fused with her royal entitlement to create a terrifying hybrid ideology. The divine right of kings meets the totalitarian efficiency of fascism. There's a photograph that haunts her biography. It shows her with her brothers. They are in SS uniforms, the black uniform of the Schutzstaffel, the organization responsible for the Holocaust. Friederike is smiling. She does not look coerced. She looks proud. She looks like a girl who believes she is on the winning side of history. This is the fatal weakness, hamartia, that would eventually destroy her. She believed that power justifies itself. She believed that strength was its own morality. When she later moved to Greece, she didn't leave this mindset in Blankenberg. She packed it in her trunk, right next to her tiaras. In the mid-1930s, the Greek monarchy was in a precarious position. The king, George II, Paul's older brother, had just been restored to the throne after years of exile, but his hold on power was shaky. He needed an heir, and Paul needed a wife. Paul was 36 years old, Friederike was 20. On paper, they were second cousins, both descendants of Queen Victoria. It was a classic royal match, but psychologically, it was a mismatch of epic proportions. Paul was a complicated man. He was deeply spiritual, interested in mysticism, and somewhat passive. He had lived a life of exile, working as a mechanic in England, living a bohemian life. He was not a natural autocrat. He was a man looking for an anchor. Friederike was the anchor. They met officially in Berlin during the 1936 Olympics, the Nazi Olympics. This setting is symbolic. While Jesse Owens was embarrassing Hitler on the track, Friederike and Paul were falling in love in the fine VIP boxes, surrounded by swastika flags and the elite of the Third Reich. Paul was captivated by her, not just by her youth, but by her certainty. Paul was a man of doubts. Friederike was a woman of convictions. She radiated an energy that he lacked. He saw in her a partner who could shoulder the burden of kingship that he secretly dreaded. Friederike saw something else. She saw a vacancy. She saw a man who could be molded. She saw a throne that, while shaky, offered her a platform to exercise the power she felt was her birthright. She wasn't just marrying a man, she was acquiring a kingdom. The engagement was announced in 1937. Immediately, the diplomatic cables began to buzz. The British Foreign Office, which kept a close eye on Greece, a vital strategic ally in the Mediterranean, was alarmed. Sir Waterlow, the British ambassador to Athens, wrote secret dispatches describing Friederike. He noted her intelligence, but also her Prussian arrogance. He worried about her German connections. Remember, this was 1937. Europe was on the brink of war. Marrying a German princess whose grandfather was the Kaiser and whose brothers were rumored to be Nazis was a diplomatic nightmare. But King George II of Greece approved the match. He believed that a German alliance might help keep Greece neutral in the coming conflict. It was a calculation that would backfire spectacularly. Friederike began to learn Greek. She threw herself into the preparations with the efficiency of a general planning an invasion. But even in her letters from this period, there is a tone of condescension. She viewed Greece as exotic and chaotic. She wrote about bringing order to her new home.
She didn't want to become Greek. She wanted to make Greece more German. Friederike arrived in Athens in January 1938. The wedding was a grand affair, a spectacle of gold coaches and cavalry. But underneath the cheers, there was a murmur of unease. The Greeks are a people with a long, painful memory. They remembered World War I. They remembered the national schism. They remembered that Germany had been the ally of Turkey, the eternal enemy. When Friederike stepped onto the balcony of the royal palace, the crowd saw a young, petite woman with a nervous smile, but those closer to her saw the steel. She found Athens to be a shock. Compared to the disciplined, manicured estates of Hanover, Athens was noisy, dirty, and politically volatile. The Greek political class was a nest of vipers, arguments, shouting matches in parliament, constant changes of government. Friederike hated it. In her memoirs written decades later, she would speak of her love for Greece, but her actions in 1938 tell a different story. She immediately isolated herself within a small circle of German-speaking aristocrats and sycophants. She complained about the lack of punctuality. She complained about the hygiene. She treated the Greek politicians not as elected representatives, but as unruly servants who needed to be disciplined. Fate, however, gave Friederike a gift. When she arrived, Greece was not a democracy. It was under the dictatorship of Ioannis Metaxas. Metaxas was a fascinating figure, a short, round, bespectacled general who had suspended the constitution on August 4, 1936. He called his regime the Third Hellenic Civilization. It was a fascist light regime, modeled on Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, but with a distinctly Greek flavor. Friederike loved Metaxas. While the liberal world condemned the dictatorship, Friederike felt right at home. The censorship of the press was good because it stopped the lies. The banning of strikes was excellent because it kept the economy moving. The secret police were necessary for order. She bonded with Metaxas. He recognized her intelligence and her ambition. He saw that she was the stronger half of the royal couple. Metaxas began to mentor her in a way. He taught her how to navigate the treacherous waters of Greek politics. But there was a dark side to this mentorship. Metaxas reinforced her worst instincts. He validated her belief that the parliamentary system was rotten. He confirmed her Nazi bias that a nation needs a single strong father figure or mother figure.
During these early years, Friederike gave birth to her first two children, Sophia, 1938, and Konstantin, 1940. She was fulfilling her primary duty, securing the succession. But as she held the infant Konstantin, the future king, she wasn't just looking at a baby, she was looking at a project. She was already planning his future, a future where he would rule as an absolute monarch, guided by her hand. She swore that her son would never be humiliated by a parliament the way her father was in Germany. By 1939, the clouds of war were gathering. Hitler invaded Poland. Europe plunged into darkness. Friederike was in a terrifying position. Her homeland, Germany, was the aggressor. Her adopted country, Greece, was desperately trying to remain neutral, but its sympathies lay with Britain. Inside the palace, the tension was palpable. King George II was staunchly pro-Britain. Paul was loyal to his brother, but Friederike. Rumors began to circulate in the cafes of Athens, whispers that the crown princess was a spy, whispers that she had a radio in her bedroom tuned to Berlin, whispers that she was writing letters to her brothers in the SS, giving them information about Greek defenses. There is no concrete historical evidence that she was an active spy, but in the court of public opinion, the truth didn't matter. She was the German. And then on October 28, 1940, the ultimatum came, not from Hitler, but from Mussolini. Italy demanded surrender. Metaxas said, nay, no.
War had come to Greece. For Friederike, this was the moment of truth. She had to choose. Was she a German princess loyal to the blood of the Kaiser, or was she a Greek queen loyal to the people who looked at her with suspicion? She chose survival. She chose to wear the mask of the Greek patriot. She donned the nurse's uniform. She visited the hospitals. She smiled for the cameras. But as she looked at the wounded Greek soldiers, did she see heroes, or did she see pawns? And deep down, as the German war machine prepared to roll south to rescue the Italians, did a part of her heart still beat to the rhythm of the marching boots in Berlin? The war would strip away the luxury of the palace. It would force her into exile. It would turn her into a refugee, and it would harden her heart into a diamond, cold, unbreakable, and capable of cutting through anything that stood in her way. The Nazi girl was about to become the Iron Queen. On April 6, 1941, the nightmare scenario that Friederike had dreaded, or perhaps secretly anticipated, became reality. Operation Merida began. The German Wehrmacht, the most terrifying military machine the world had ever seen, crossed the Greek border to rescue their failing Italian allies. This was the moment the drama-filled contradiction of Friederike's life ripped her world apart. The soldiers invading her husband's kingdom were not faceless enemies. They were her countrymen. Among the officers leading the charge were men she had danced with at balls in Berlin. Her own brothers, Ernst August and George William, were serving in the German military. Imagine the psychological fracture in the Tati Palace. Outside, the air raid sirens were wailing. Inside, Friederike was packing the crown jewels into wooden crates. Every bomb that fell on a Greek village was dropped by a force that her family supported. To the Greek people, she was the queen. To the invaders, she was a German princess who had married into a hostile family. Friederike made a choice in those desperate hours that would define her survival. She realized that if she showed even a flicker of sympathy for Germany, she would be lynched. She had to overcompensate. She became more anti-Nazi than the Greeks themselves. She broadcasted messages of resistance. She rallied the staff. But deep in the archives of history, there are whispers of a different story. Some reports suggest that Hitler had given specific orders that the Greek royal family was not to be harmed if captured, specifically because of Friederike. She was his insurance policy. Whether she knew this or not, she carried the invisible shield of her German blood. On April 23rd, the Greek army surrendered. The king, Friederike, and the children fled to Crete. And then, as the German paratroopers rained down from the sky, they boarded a British destroyer for Egypt. As she watched the coast of Greece disappear, Friederike wasn't just losing a home. She was losing the stage upon which she had planned to build her empire. She was now a queen without a country, a German woman in a British warship, sailing into an uncertain exile. The British government did not want Friederike in Egypt. They knew her background. They knew that Cairo was a nest of spies,
and they didn't trust a Hanoverian princess anywhere near the front lines. They packed the family off to South Africa, far away from the action. For most people, Cape Town would have been a safe haven. For Friederike, it was a prison. She was addicted to power, and in South Africa, she was irrelevant. But she found a substitute for power in the form of a mentor, Field Marshal Jan Smuts, the Prime Minister of South Africa. Smuts was a brilliant philosopher-statesman, but he was also a man who believed in rigid hierarchies. He was the architect of segregation, the precursor to apartheid. He believed that the civilized few had a moral duty to rule the uncivilized many. Friederike worshipped him. She called him Yanni, Uncle Yanni.
They spent hours walking on Table Mountain, discussing philosophy and politics. This relationship is critical to understanding her future actions. Smuts reinforced her fatal weakness, her belief that democracy was messy and inefficient. He taught her that a true leader must be willing to ignore the voices of the masses for their own good. In the safety of Smuts's estate, Friederike's political philosophy hardened. She watched the news from Greece, the rise of the communist resistance fighters, EAM-AL. While these fighters were dying to liberate Greece from the Nazis, Friederike viewed them not as heroes, but as the next enemy. She began to bombard her husband, Crown Prince Paul, and the Greek government in exile with letters. She demanded that they take a harder line. She intrigued against the Prime Minister, Emmanuel Suderos. She spread poison against anyone who suggested that the king should share power after the war. The nightmare was growing. In the isolation of exile, stripped of her duties, Friederike's energy turned inward and became toxic. She convinced herself that she and Paul were the only things standing between Greece and total anarchy. She was no longer just fighting for a throne. She was fighting a holy war against an ideology she hated. The war ended in 1945, but the royal family was not immediately invited back. The Greek people were divided. Many blamed the monarchy for the dictatorship of Metaxas. A plebiscite was held in September 1946. The result was 69% in favor of the king's return. It looked like a victory, but it was a victory born of fear. The Cold War had begun. The Greeks voted for the king not because they loved him, but because they were terrified of the communists to the north. They wanted a shield. Friederike returned to a Greece that was unrecognizable. The infrastructure was gone. The economy was dead. The mountains were full of communist partisans. Then in April 1947, King George II died suddenly of a heart attack. The moment Friederike had been preparing for since she was a girl in Blankenberg had arrived. Her husband became King Paul I. She was now Queen Friederike of the Hellenes. She did not waste a second. Within weeks, the shy princess who had arrived in 1938 was gone. In her place was a dynamo. She effectively pushed Paul aside. Paul was the head of state, but Friederike was the spine. She began to attend briefings. She toured the countryside. She met with American generals who were pouring money into Greece under the Truman Doctrine. She realized something that the politicians missed. In a country broken by war, the person who controls the food and the narrative controls the nation. The Greek Civil War, 1946 to 1949, was vicious. Brother killed brother. It was a proxy war between the US and the Soviet Union. Friederike treated the Civil War as her personal stage. She donned military fatigues, a shocking sight for a queen. She traveled to the front lines in Kona and Gramos. She stood in the mud with the soldiers. The propaganda value was immense. The soldier queen, the newspapers called her. It was a brilliant manipulation of image. By standing with the army, she forged a bond of blood with the military leadership. She made them loyal to her, not the Constitution. But behind the heroics lay a darker reality. She viewed the communists not as political opponents, but as miasma, a pollution that had to be cleansed. And to cleanse the nation, she decided she had to capture its soul, the children. This period remains the most controversial chapter of her life, and the one that defined how history would judge her. Friederike established a network of 58 camps, known as the Pedopole, child cities. The official purpose was humanitarian, to save children from the war zones, to protect them from being kidnapped by the communists and taken behind the Iron Curtain. And it is true, the communists did take children, but Friederike's response was to do the exact same thing, but with better branding.
Thousands of children were gathered from the villages of northern Greece. Many were orphans, but many others were taken from families suspected of leftist sympathies. Inside the Pokolis, the children were fed and clothed, but they were also re-educated. The curriculum was simple: God,
The Orthodox Church, king, absolute loyalty to Paul and Friederike. Country, hatred of communism. Critics called them the Janissaries of the Queen, a reference to the Ottoman practice of taking Christian children and raising them as elite soldiers for the Sultan. The parallel to Friederike's own youth is unavoidable. She had seen how the Third Reich used the Hitler Youth to break the bond between child and parent, replacing family loyalty with state loyalty. She applied the same Nazi mechanism to the Greek children. She wasn't just saving them from hunger. She was stripping them of their parents' ideology and reprogramming them to be her Praetorian Guard. She would visit the camps often. The children were taught to call her Mother. It was a psychological masterstroke. She was positioning herself as the literal mother of the nation. One of the most chilling aspects of this period was her rhetoric. In speeches, she spoke of saving the Greek soul. She spoke of hygiene and purity. It was the language of eugenics softened for a democratic audience. By the time the Civil War ended in 1949, with the defeat of the Communists, Friederike had emerged as the most powerful woman in Europe. She had a victorious army that adored her. She had American backing. She had a husband who deferred to her. She had won the war, but she had lost the peace. Because in the villages of the north, where mothers wept for children who had been taken to the Queen cities, a deep, burning hatred was taking root. They saw her not as a savior, but as a child stealer. They saw the German arrogance. They saw the woman who thought she owned their children. Friederike stood atop the ruins of Greece, triumphant. She believed she was invincible, but she had forgotten the lesson of Greek tragedy. Hubris is always followed by nemesis. She had built a fortress of power, but the foundation was made of resentment. And as the 1950s dawned, she would make the mistake of thinking that the war was over. She didn't realize that the real war, the war for the heart of the people, was just beginning. And this time, she wouldn't be fighting communists in the mountains. She would be fighting the very politicians she had brought to power. By 1950, the guns of the Civil War had fallen silent. The communists had been defeated, pushed back into the mountains of Albania and Bulgaria. Greece was technically at peace, but for Queen Friederike, peace was a dangerous vacuum. War had given her a purpose. It had allowed her to play the role of the warrior queen, the mother of the soldier. Now, with the threat of immediate violence gone, she had to find a new way to dominate. She founded it in the shadows of the Greek constitution. The 1950s in Greece were a time of reconstruction, funded largely by the American Marshall Plan. But while the buildings were being repaired, the political foundation was rotting. Friederike, emboldened by her victory in the Civil War, decided that the parliamentary democracy she had sworn to protect was in fact an obstacle. She began to construct what historians call the Parakratos, the parallel state, or shadow government. This was the ultimate manifestation of her authoritarian upbringing. She remembered how the Weimar Republic in Germany had been weak and indecisive. She was determined that Greece would not suffer the same fate. She believed that the only thing holding the chaotic Greek nation together was the monarchy, specifically her version of the monarchy. She effectively sidelined her husband. King Paul was the head of state, but Friederike was the chief of operations. She demanded to see all state papers before the prime minister saw them.
She sat in on meetings with military chiefs, not as an observer, but as a participant. When a general spoke, he didn't look at the king. He looked at the queen to see if she was smiling or frowning. This was her authoritarian instinct evolving. In the Third Reich, power didn't flow through laws. It flowed through personal loyalty to the leader. Friederike replicated this. She built a network of officers within the army, men who owed their careers to her patronage. This secret society, known as Idea Sacred Bond of Greek Officers, was a far-right organization dedicated to protecting the throne at all costs, even if it meant destroying democracy. Friederike cultivated these men. She invited them to tea at Tatatoy. She flattered their egos. She whispered in their ears that the politicians were corrupt, that the left was regrouping, and that they, the men with the guns, were the true guardians of the nation. She was planting the seeds of the military dictatorship that would eventually consume her son. But in the early 1950s, she saw these men simply as her personal Praetorian Guard. Her obsession with control led to a vicious conflict with the only man in Greece who rivaled her popularity, Field Marshal Alexander Papagatos. Papagatos was the hero of the Greco-Italian War and the victor of the Civil War. He was a staunch royalist, a man of immense dignity, and a father figure to the nation. He should have been Friederike's greatest ally. Instead, she saw him as a threat. Why? Because Papagatos was a strong man, and in Friederike's universe, there was only room for one strong personality. When Papagatos decided to enter politics and form a conservative party, the Greek Rally, to bring stability to the country, Friederike panicked. She feared a strong prime minister would reduce the palace's influence. She began a campaign of whispers against him. She questioned his loyalty. She tried to manipulate the king into refusing to give him the mandate to form a government, despite his overwhelming popularity. This was a critical moment of drama-filled contradiction. The queen, who claimed to be the ultimate anti-communist, was sabotaging the most effective anti-communist leader in the country simply because his shadow was too long. It revealed her fatal weakness, narcissism. She would rather rule over a weak, chaotic government than share power with a strong, competent one. While she fought dirty battles in Athens, Friederike looked abroad for legitimacy. She understood the New World Order better than any Greek politician. She knew that London was fading and Washington was the new Rome. If she could charm the Americans, she would be untouchable. In 1953, King Paul and Queen Friederike undertook a grand state visit to the United States. It was a triumph of public relations. Friederike, with her fluent English and her German charm, which she could turn on and off like a light switch, dazzled the American press. She presented herself as the frontline queen, the woman standing on the barricades of the Cold War against the Soviet Union. The Americans, obsessed with the Red Scare, ate it up. They saw her as a democratic heroine. They didn't see the secret police, the camps, or the manipulation back home. They saw a pretty woman in a tiara talking about freedom. Friederike played the Americans like a violin. She secured massive amounts of aid for Greece, but she also secured political insurance for herself. When she returned to Athens, she carried the aura of American approval. She used this to bully her opponents. If a politician disagreed with her, she would subtly imply that the American embassy was on her side. But this success fed her hubris. She began to believe her own press clippings. She started to believe that she was a player on the world stage, a peer of Eisenhower and Churchill, rather than the consort of a constitutional monarch in a small Balkan state. This inflation of ego made her increasingly deaf to the grumblings of her own people.
If there is one event that perfectly encapsulates the deep dive in Friederike's disconnect from reality, it is the cruise of the Agamemnon in August 1954. Greece was still economically shattered. The drachma had been devalued, unemployment was high, thousands of Greeks were immigrating to Germany and Australia just to feed their families. In this climate of austerity, Friederike decided to throw the party of the century. She chartered the luxury liner Agamemnon, a state-owned vessel. She sent invitations to the Gotha, the almanac of European royalty. She invited over 100 kings, queens, princes, and princesses from every corner of the continent. The guest list was a who's who of the Blue Bloods: the King and Queen of Sweden, the Queen of the Netherlands, the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, the Count of Paris, and dozens of German princes and princesses. The official reason for this extravagance was to promote Greek tourism. It was a flimsy lie. The real reason was eugenics and matchmaking. Friederike was obsessed with purity of blood. She was a matchmaker on an imperial scale. She wanted to secure suitable spouses for her children, Sophia, then 16, and Konstantin, 14. She viewed the Agamemnon as a floating breeding ground, a place where the royal youth could mingle without the prying eyes of the press or the contamination of commoners. It was a royal meat market. The cost was astronomical. While the palace claimed the royals paid their own way, the reality was that the Greek state bore the brunt of the logistical and security costs. The ship was stocked with the finest wines, the best food, and an army of servants. For 2 weeks, the Agamemnon sailed over the Greek islands. The royals visited ancient ruins by day and danced in ballrooms by night. It was a fantasy world, hermetically sealed from the poverty of the nation that was paying for it. It revealed where she truly belonged, not among the voters she ruled, but among the crowns she coveted, feeling far more kinship with a deposed German prince than with any Greek democrat. She was signaling to the world that her primary allegiance was to the International Trade Union of Kings, not to the Greek people. The cruise was a tactical success. It facilitated the meeting between Sophia and Juan Carlos of Spain, though their romance would bloom later. But it was a strategic disaster. It was the moment the Greek public began to turn against her. The newspapers, heavily censored but still clever, began to publish cartoons. They contrasted the queen's luxury with the people's misery. The Agamemnon became a symbol of her arrogance. It was her version of let them eat cake. She didn't understand why the people were angry. In her mind, she was bringing glory to Greece by hosting the elite. She couldn't say that to a hungry man. Glory is inedible. When Field Marshal Papagas died in 1955, Friederike saw an opportunity to regain total control. She needed a prime minister who would be competent enough to run the economy, but obedient enough to follow palace orders. She chose Konstantin Karamanlis. Karamanlis was a junior minister, a man from the north. Rough-hewn and not part of the old Athenian aristocracy, Friederike believed she had found the perfect puppet. She bypassed more senior politicians to appoint him, a move that enraged the political establishment. She thought she could manipulate him. She was wrong. Karamanlis turned out to be a visionary leader with a spine of steel. He began to modernize Greece at a breakneck pace. He built roads, electrified villages, and stabilized the currency. But as his power grew, Friederike's jealousy returned. She realized too late that she had appointed a man who didn't need her. To counter the rising independence of the political government, Friederike strengthened her shadow state. The late 1950s saw the intensification of police surveillance. This was the era where the Nazi mechanism became institutionalized.
The palace controlled the royal genie and the secret service. Chi files were kept on every citizen. To get a job in the civil service, to get a driver's license, even to go to university, a Greek citizen needed a certificate of social convictions, essentially a document from the police stating they were not a communist. Friederike was the spiritual godmother of this system. She believed that the state had the right to pry into the souls of its citizens. If you didn't support the king, you were a traitor. There was no middle ground. The atmosphere in Athens became suffocating. Intellectuals, artists, and students felt the heavy hand of the queen's morality. She censored plays she found offensive. She dictated social mores. She was trying to turn Greece into a giant version of the Ptolemies, a camp where everyone was well-behaved, obedient, and sang the national anthem on command. One of the most damaging aspects of this period was the financial opacity of the monarchy. Friederike demanded a lifestyle that the Greek budget could not support. She constantly badgered the government for more money, for yachts, for renovations to the Takiti Palace, for travel. When the government hesitated, she would throw tantrums. There are accounts of her screaming at ministers, reminding them of who she was. She used the Royal Welfare Fund, a charity organization she controlled, as a personal slush fund, mixing state money with private expenses. This wasn't just greed, it was entitlement. In her worldview, the state existed to support the dignity of the crown. If the queen looked poor, the nation looked poor. Therefore, her luxury was a patriotic necessity. By 1958, the cracks were showing. The left was reorganizing under the banner of IDA, United Democratic Left. They were gaining votes not because people loved communism, but because they hated the police state. Friederike's response to this rising tide was not to compromise, but to dig in. She became more paranoid, more aggressive. She saw enemies everywhere. She convinced herself that Karamanlis was soft, that the Americans were naive, and that she alone understood the danger. She was preparing for a war against her own people. She didn't realize that the era of absolute monarchs was over. She was a 19th century queen living in a 1960s world, and the collision between her delusions and reality was about to destroy everything she had built. The 1950s ended with Friederike at the height of her power, but it was a brittle power. She was feared, but she was not loved. And in a democracy, even a flawed one, fear has an expiration date. By the turn of the decade, Queen Friederike had set her sights on her next great conquest, the marriage of her eldest daughter, Princess Sophia. She had groomed Sophia for this moment since birth, breaking the girl's spirit to ensure she would be the perfect consort for a future king. The target was Juan Carlos of Spain, the heir to a throne that didn't technically exist yet, as Spain was still under the thumb of General Franco. But for Friederike, a wedding was not just a union of hearts, it was a transaction of state. And in her world, the world of the almanacca and the German aristocracy, a princess did not enter a marriage empty-handed. She required a dowry. In 1962, Friederike made a demand that would ultimately sever the bond between the monarchy and the Greek people. She demanded that the Greek parliament approve a dowry of $300,000, roughly $3 million today, for Sophia. To the modern ear, this sounds like an archaic footnote. To the Greek citizen of 1962, it was a declaration of class warfare. Greece was still a poor country. The average worker earned a pittance. The idea that their taxes, sweated out of rocky soil and grueling factory shifts, should go to pay for a Spanish prince's comfort was repugnant. Prime Minister Konstantin Karamanlis, the man Friederike had once thought was her puppet, was horrified. He understood the political reality that Friederike ignored. He warned her that this demand would be weaponized by the left. He pleaded with her to use the royal family's private fortune,
or perhaps scale back the pageantry. Friederike refused. This refusal reveals the fatal weakness at the core of her manipulation: entitlement disguised as tradition. In her mind, the dignity of the House of Hanover and the House of Glücksburg was worth more than the public's goodwill. She viewed the state treasury not as the people's money, but as the king's allowance. She bullied Karamanes. She threatened to create a constitutional crisis. She effectively held the government hostage until they agreed to pay. The bill passed, but the victory was Pyrrhic. The opposition party, the Center Union, boycotted the vote. Their slogan, "A dowry for education, not for Sophia," became the rallying cry of a generation. When Sophia and Juan Carlos were married in a glittering Orthodox ceremony in Athens, the streets were lined with cheering royalists, but the universities and the factories were seething. Friederike had bought her daughter a husband, but she had sold the monarchy's soul to do it. The dowry scandal was merely the opening shot in a much larger war. The relationship between Queen Friederike and Prime Minister Karamanes had turned into a death spiral. They were the two most powerful people in Greece, and they hated each other. Karamanes was a man of the state. He believed in institutions, in laws, and in modernization. He wanted to transform Greece into a European democracy where the king reigned but did not rule. Friederike was a woman of the dynasty. She believed in the divine right, in personal loyalty, and in the shadow state. She wanted a Greece where the prime minister was simply the king's first servant. The conflict was structural, but it was also deeply personal. Friederike was jealous of Karamanes. She saw the crowds cheering for him. She saw the Western leaders respecting him. In her Nazi mechanism worldview, there could be only one leader, a Führer. If the prime minister was strong, the throne was weak. Therefore, the prime minister had to be destroyed. She began to undermine him at every turn. She used her private network of military officers to bypass the Ministry of Defense. She communicated directly with foreign governments, conducting her own foreign policy. She criticized his economic policies at dinner parties, knowing the whispers would get back to him. It was a dangerous game of chicken. Karamanes knew that he served at the pleasure of the king, and the king was controlled by his mother. He tried to resign twice, but King Paul, caught between his formidable wife and his capable prime minister, persuaded him to stay. But the mechanism of evil was relentless. Friederike needed a crisis to prove that Karamanes was incompetent, and in the summer of 1963, she created one. This moment marked the point at which her authority began to unravel. It is an event so bizarre, so humiliating that it sounds like fiction. In April 1963, Queen Friederike was in London for the wedding of Princess Alexandra of Kent. The Greek government, specifically Karamanes, had advised her not to go. The political atmosphere in London was toxic for the Greek royals. There were protests about the political prisoners still held in Greek jails since the Civil War. Friederike ignored the advice. She believed she was untouchable. She believed that her royal status was a force field that no protester could penetrate. She was wrong. Outside Claridge's hotel, a woman named Betty Ambitilos was waiting. Betty was British, but she was married to Tony Ambitilos, a Greek communist trade unionist who had been imprisoned for 16 years. Betty had spent years trying to present a petition to the Queen, asking for her husband's release. Friederike had always ignored her. On this day, Betty did not just hold a sign. When Friederike emerged from the hotel, Betty Ambitilos lunged. She didn't have a weapon. She had a voice and she had rage.
She grabbed the Queen's shoulders. She screamed in her face, "Release my husband!" The Queen's bodyguards were slow to react. Friederike, the woman who had stared down generals, panicked. She broke free and ran. Imagine the scene. The Queen of the Hellenes, a granddaughter of the Kaiser, fleeing down a London street like a common thief, pursued by a furious housewife. She ran into a mews, a small back street, and banged on the door of an American actress, Marty Stevens. "I am the Queen of Greece," she gasped. "Please let me in." She hid in the stranger's hallway until the police arrived. The news went global. Queen chased by housewife, royal humiliation. The image of the Iron Queen cowering in a doorway shattered her aura of invincibility. It revealed that beneath the tiara, she was just a terrified woman running from the consequences of her own regime. Instead of feeling shame, Friederike felt fury. And she directed that fury at the only target she cared about,
Karamanlis. She accused him of failing to protect her. She accused the British police of being complicit. She demanded that Karamanlis invoke a diplomatic crisis with Britain. She wanted the British government to apologize, to arrest, to grovel. Karamanlis refused. He knew that picking a fight with Britain over a street protest was diplomatic suicide. He told the king that the Queen had brought this on herself by ignoring his advice. That was the breaking point. Friederike decided that Karamanlis had to go. She poisoned King Paul's mind against him. She convinced the dying king that Karamanlis was disrespectful, that he was disloyal, that he was trying to usurp the throne. In June 1963, after a heated argument with the king over a proposed royal visit to London, which Karamanlis opposed for security reasons, the prime minister resigned. "I cannot govern with the queen's shadow over me," he reportedly told his close aides. Friederike had won. She had driven away the most competent politician in modern Greek history. She had purified the government of anyone who would challenge her. But in doing so, she had removed the safety valve. Karamanlis was the dam holding back the floodwaters of the center left. By destroying him, she opened the gates for George Papandreou and the Center Union. Men who were not content to simply argue with the palace, but who wanted to dismantle its power completely. With Karamanlis gone, Greece plunged into a period of instability. Elections were held in November 1963, and the Center Union won a plurality. George Papandreou, the old man of democracy, became prime minister. Papandreou was a charismatic orator, a man who spoke of change and dignity. He was everything Friederike despised. He was a liberal. He wanted to release political prisoners. He wanted to curb the power of the army and the police. For Friederike, this was the nightmare scenario. The communists, in her mind, anyone left of center was a communist, were at the gates. But she was distracted by a more personal tragedy. King Paul was dying. The king had been diagnosed with stomach cancer. As his health deteriorated in late 1963 and early 1964, Friederike's grip on the state tightened even further. She became the gatekeeper. No one saw the king without her permission. She controlled the flow of medical information. This period reveals the drama-filled contradiction of her role as a wife and a queen. She was genuinely devastated by Paul's illness. They were a devoted couple. But she could not stop plotting. Even as he lay on his deathbed, she was maneuvering to ensure that her influence would survive him. She began to focus her attention on Crown Prince Konstantin. He was 23 years old, an Olympic gold medalist in sailing, handsome and popular. But he was politically naive. He had lived his entire life in his mother's shadow. Friederike began the final phase of her indoctrination. She spent hours by Paul's bedside with Konstantin, whispering the lessons of kingship.
But they were the lessons of the 19th century, not the 20th. Trust the army. Don't trust the politicians. You are chosen by God. Be strong. She was preparing him to be a king, but she was programming him to be a dictator. She was transferring her own fears, her own Nazi mechanism of control into his young mind. She was setting him up for a collision with democracy that he did not have the skills to navigate. As 1964 dawned, the king lay dying. The popular Karamanlis was in self-imposed exile in Paris, and a liberal government was demanding reform. The storm was about to break, and standing in the eye of the hurricane, convinced she could control the weather, was Friederike. On March 6, 1964, King Paul I of the Hellenes died of stomach cancer. The nation plunged into mourning, but within the walls of the Tatoi Palace, the grief was overshadowed by a frantic struggle for position. The new king, Konstantin II, was 23 years old. He was an Olympic gold medalist, handsome, athletic, and deeply loved by the Greek people. He represented a fresh start. He was the fairy tale prince come to life. The people hoped that with his accession, the dark clouds of the civil war and the police state would finally dissipate. But there was a problem. The problem was standing right next to him. By tradition and by protocol, when a king dies, his widow becomes the queen mother. Her role is to step back into the shadows, to become a figure of silent dignity, allowing the new king and his consort to shine. She is supposed to be a memory, not a participant. Friederike tore up the rulebook. From the very first day of Konstantin's reign, Friederike made it clear that she was not going anywhere. She refused to move out of the royal residence. She refused to dismiss her private staff. She refused to stop attending the king's daily briefings with his ministers. Diplomats in Athens began to send encrypted cables back to their capitals with a worrying phrase, the dowry. Greece was being ruled by two monarchs. One was the king on the throne. The other was the queen behind the curtain. Friederike's manipulation of her son during this period was absolute. She played on his insecurities.
She told him that he was young, that the politicians were wolves, and that only mother had the experience to guide him. She effectively infantilized a head of state. When ministers came to brief the king, they often found Friederike sitting in the corner taking notes, interrupting and correcting her son. This was the Nazi mechanism of centralized control reasserting itself. She could not conceive of power as something to be shared or delegated. To her, power was a zero-sum game. If she stepped back, she lost. So she stayed, hovering over the young king like a black cloud, ensuring that his reign would be nothing more than an extension of hers. If the politicians were Friederike's political enemies, Anne-Marie of Denmark was her personal nemesis. The marriage of Constantine to Anne-Marie was supposed to be the dawn of a new era. Anne-Marie was the youngest daughter of the King of Denmark. She came from a monarchy that was democratic, unpretentious, and beloved by its people. She rode bicycles in Copenhagen. She shopped without bodyguards. She was everything Friederike was not: modern, fresh, and naturally charming. Friederike hated her. She viewed Anne-Marie not as a daughter-in-law to be nurtured, but as a rival to be crushed. She called her the usurper. The psychological warfare began before the wedding cake was even cut. Friederike, obsessed with protocol and hierarchy, constantly belittled Anne-Marie. She criticized her clothes, calling them provincial. She criticized her Greek, which Anne-Marie was struggling to learn. She mocked her shyness. But the true battleground was the household. By royal tradition, the wife of the king is the mistress of the house. She holds the keys, she decides the menus, she manages the staff. Friederike refused to hand over the keys.
There are accounts from palace staff describing awkward, humiliating scenes where Anne-Marie would try to give an order to a servant, only to be told, "I'm sorry, Your Majesty, but the Queen Mother has given different instructions." Friederike maintained her own court within the palace. She would burst into the young couple's private apartments without knocking. She would rearrange the furniture. She would dictate who they could see and who they couldn't. This was the behavior of a classic narcissist. She was trying to erase Anne-Marie's identity. She wanted to prove to Constantine and to herself that no woman could ever replace her. The public impact of this was devastating. The Greeks loved Anne-Marie. They saw her as a victim, and they saw Constantine as a weakling who couldn't protect his wife from his mother. It stripped away his aura of authority. How could he be the father of the nation if he was still a scared little boy in his own home? Friederike was destroying the very institution she claimed to be protecting. She was turning the monarchy into a soap opera, a dysfunctional family drama that played out in the gossip columns while the country was burning. While Friederike was waging war on her daughter-in-law, a real war was brewing with the government. The Center Union Party, led by Georgios Papandreou, had won a landslide victory in the elections of February 1964, securing 53% of the vote. Papandreou had a clear mandate to reform Greece. He wanted to curb the power of the palace, clean up the intelligence services, KYA, and assert civilian control over the military. To Friederike, this was treason. Her fatal weakness, the belief that the army belonged to the crown, was triggered. She convinced Constantine that Papandreou was a dangerous radical who was opening the door to communism. She fed the king's paranoia. The flashpoint was the Espida scandal. In May 1965, a plot was discovered within the army. A group of center-left officers was accused of conspiring to purge right-wing royalists. The alleged leader of this secret group was none other than Andreas Papandreou, the prime minister's son. Historians have long debated whether Espida was a real threat or a fabrication of the right-wing intelligence agencies. But for Friederike, it didn't matter. It was the weapon she needed. She urged Constantine to take a hard line. "They are coming for your throne," she whispered. "If you lose the army, you lose everything." The crisis came to a head in July 1965. Georgios Papandreou went to the palace to offer his resignation if the king did not allow him to take the defense ministry. He expected a negotiation.
Instead, Constantine accepted the resignation immediately, almost before Papandreou had finished speaking. Within minutes, a new prime minister, a defector from Papandreou's own party, was sworn in. It was a trap. It was a palace coup. The king had effectively fired a prime minister who had the support of the majority of the Greek people. This event, known as the apostasia, the defection or the apostasy, set Athens on fire. For 70 days, the city was a war zone. Hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets. They weren't just protesting a political maneuver, they were protesting the violation of their dignity, and they knew exactly who was to blame. The chants that echoed off the marble buildings of Athens were specific. They didn't just shout, "Down with the king." They shouted, "Take your mother and go. Friederike, leave." The people identified Friederike as the architect of the chaos. They saw the German hand behind the young king's foolishness.
Friederike, watching from the windows of Tatoi, was terrified. This was not the obedient Greece she thought she ruled. This was a mob, and it was a mob that hated her. But instead of retreating, she doubled down. She viewed the protests as proof that the communists were trying to take over. She urged Konstantin not to compromise. She urged him to rely on the army and the police to restore order. For the next 2 years, from July 1965 to April 1967, Greece was a political zombie. Governments rose and fell every few weeks. Parliament was a circus of bribery and defection. The king tried to appoint puppet prime ministers, but none could gain a stable majority. The diarchy had succeeded in destroying Papandreou, but it had destroyed the country in the process. Friederike's fatal weakness, her inability to compromise, had led the monarchy into a trap. By making the king a partisan player, she had stripped him of his legitimacy. He was no longer the symbol of the nation. He was the leader of the right. And in the barracks, the colonels were watching. Men like George Papadopoulos and Stylianos Patakos, men Friederike had nurtured, men whose careers she had promoted, were looking at the chaos with cold eyes. They saw a weak king. They saw a meddling queen mother. They saw corrupt politicians. They decided that the system was broken. They decided that they were the only ones who could save Greece. Friederike thought she was using the army to control the politicians. She didn't realize that the army was about to decide it didn't need the palace anymore. She was feeding a tiger thinking it was a house cat, and the tiger was getting hungry. As 1967 approached, elections were scheduled for May. All polls showed that Georgios Papandreou and the Center Union would win again, this time with an even bigger majority. Friederike and Konstantin began to plan a general's coup. They planned to suspend the constitution to prevent Papandreou from taking power. They were plotting against their own people, but they were too slow. The deep dive into this period reveals the ultimate irony. Friederike spent her life fighting against democracy, believing it was the enemy of the throne. In the end, it wasn't democracy that killed the monarchy. It was the very authoritarianism she had worshipped. The stage was set for the tanks, the stage was set for the silence, and the stage was set for the final humiliating exile of the woman who thought she owned Greece. The tragedy of Queen Friederike reached its climax in the early hours of April 21, 1967. For years, she had preached a specific gospel to the Greek military. Politicians are corrupt, democracy is dangerous, and the army is the only true guardian of the nation. She had nurtured the deep state. She had encouraged the idea that force was a legitimate tool of politics. On that night, the lesson she taught came back to haunt her. Friederike and King Constantine were indeed plotting a coup.
They had planned to suspend the constitution in May to prevent the Center Union Party from winning the upcoming elections. They were preparing a general's coup, a top-owned royalist intervention that would keep the king in charge, but they were too slow. A group of middle-ranking officers, colonels, not generals, decided they didn't need the king's permission to save the country. Led by George Papadopoulos and Stylianos Patakos, these men were the spiritual children of Friederike's ideology. They were ultra-nationalists, fiercely anti-communist, and obsessed with moral purity. They were exactly the kind of soldiers Friederike had praised in her speeches. When the tanks rolled up to the gates of Tatoi Palace at 2 a.m., the king tried to call his generals. The lines were dead. The colonels had arrested the royalist leadership in their pajamas. The shadow government men that Friederike had spent decades building had been hijacked. The scene inside the palace was one of utter humiliation. The Queen Mother, the woman who had made prime ministers tremble, was reduced to a helpless bystander. She tried to assert her authority. She tried to speak to the officers as the mother of the army. They ignored her. To the colonels, she was no longer a leader. She was a liability, a symbol of the old corrupt establishment they claimed to be sweeping away. Later that morning, the king faced a choice. The colonels demanded he swear in their new military government. If he refused, they would abolish the monarchy immediately. If he agreed, he would remain king, but as a puppet. Constantine, young and terrified, looked to his mother. Friederike, ever the pragmatist, urged survival. She believed that if they stayed in the game, they could eventually outmaneuver the colonels. She believed the Nazi mechanism of hierarchy would eventually reassert itself. So Constantine swore them in. There is a famous photograph from that day. The king stands in the center, looking like a man at his own funeral. The colonels stand around him looking grim and triumphant, and lurking in the background is the shadow of Friederike. By legitimizing the junta, the monarchy committed moral suicide.
They became accomplices to a brutal dictatorship that would torture thousands of citizens. In the eyes of the democratic world, and more importantly, in the eyes of the Greek people, the king had sold his soul to save his crown. For 8 months, the royal family lived as prisoners in their own palace. The junta ruled with an iron fist. They censored the press, banned long hair and miniskirts, and arrested anyone who whispered a word against them. Friederike was furious. She was not used to being irrelevant. She began to push Konstantin to act. "You are the king," she would tell him. "The people love you. The army loves you. Strike back." This was her fatal weakness, blinding her again. She still believed in the myth of royal popularity. She didn't understand that by swearing in the junta, Konstantin had alienated the Democrats, and by plotting against the junta, he was alienating the fascists. He had no friends left. On December 13, 1967, the king launched his counter-coup. It was a disaster of amateurism. The royal family, Konstantin, Anne-Marie, who was pregnant, their children, and Friederike, flew to the northern city of Kavala. They hoped to rally loyal troops and march on Athens. But the plan had no secrecy. The junta knew everything. They simply cut the phone lines to the north, arrested the few loyal generals, and announced on the radio that the king was trying to start a civil war. The king's movement collapsed in a single day. There were no mass uprisings. The Greek people, tired of the palace's games, stayed home. They watched the drama unfold with indifference. By evening, it was over. The loyal units were surrounded. The fuel was running low. The king realized that if he stayed, he would be arrested or executed.
The flight from Kavala to Rome is the final tragic image of Friederike's power. The family packed into a small Gulfstream aircraft. The pilot had to fly low to avoid radar. They flew through a terrible storm. Inside the cabin, the Iron Queen sat in silence. She was holding her grandchildren. She had no clothes, no money, and no plan. She was fleeing the country she had tried to mold in her own image. As the lights of Greece disappeared into the dark Adrian, Friederike must have realized the magnitude of her failure. She had spent 30 years fighting to make the monarchy absolute, and her efforts had resulted in its total destruction. They landed in Rome at 4 a.m. They were refugees. The Italian government, not wanting to offend the colonels in Athens, treated them coolly. There was no red carpet. There was only the cold reality of exile. While the royal family languished in exile, first in Rome, then in Copenhagen, and finally in London, the junta in Athens used Friederike as their greatest propaganda weapon. The dictators knew they were unpopular. To justify their rule, they had to create a villain, and who better than the German woman? They opened the palace archives. They published stories about her spending, her interference in politics, her letters to the SS brothers. They painted a picture of a monarchy that was corrupt, anti-Greek, and obsessed with its own wealth. Friederike became the scapegoat for everything that had gone wrong in Greece since the war. The junta told the people, "Look, we are bad, but remember her. She was worse." From her exile, Friederike tried to fight back. She wrote her memoirs, A Measure of Understanding. It was a book filled with self-justification. She blamed the communists. She blamed the Americans. She blamed the British. She never accepted a shred of responsibility. She wrote about mysticism and quantum physics, trying to sound like a philosopher queen. But the world saw only a bitter old woman, refusing to admit she was wrong. Her presence was a millstone around Konstantin's neck. Every time the king tried to negotiate a return, the shadow of his mother loomed over him. The democratic opposition made it clear, we might accept the king, but we will never accept the queen mother. Konstantin was forced to distance himself from her. He set up his own household in London, while she eventually moved to India to study philosophy with a guru, and then to Spain. The nightmare mother-in-law was finally pushed out of the family circle, not by a daughter-in-law, but by the brutal necessity of politics. In July 1974, the junta collapsed after a disastrous attempt to annex Cyprus led to a Turkish invasion. The military handed power back to the civilians, and the man invited back to restore democracy was none other than Konstantin Karamanlis. The man she had forced out returned as the one person strong enough to close the monarchy's final chapter. The man Friederike had driven out of Greece in 1963 was now the undisputed master of the country, while she was a stateless exile. Karamanlis legalized the Communist Party. He called for a referendum on the monarchy. It was the final showdown. King Konstantin was not allowed to return to Greece to campaign. He had to make a televised speech from London. He apologized for his mistakes. He promised to be a quiet constitutional monarch. He promised that his mother would not return.
But the Greek people didn't believe him. The campaign posters of the anti-monarchists were brutal. One famous poster showed a picture of Friederike with the caption, "Has he really changed? Look at who raised him." Another slogan captured the national mood, "We gave the junta to the people, we will give the king to the Queen Mother." On December the 8th, 1974, the vote was held. The result was a landslide, 69.2%.
She had lost the argument of history. The people had rejected her vision of a guided democracy. They chose the chaos of freedom over the order of the palace. The final years of Friederike were spent in a twilight world. She lived in Madrid under the protection of the Spanish monarchy. Her daughter Sofia was now Queen of Spain. Having applied the lessons of Stoicism her mother taught her, Friederike spent her days studying Hindu philosophy and vegetarianism. She tried to find spiritual peace, but her political bitterness never left her. She watched from afar as Greece flourished under the Third Republic. She watched as the socialists came to power in 1981 under Andreas Papandreou, the son of the man she had destroyed in 1965. The ultimate humiliation came on February 6, 1981. Friederike died in a clinic in Madrid. She did not die in a grand battle. She did not die of old age. She died during cosmetic surgery to remove baggy skin from her eyelids. The cause of death was heart failure, likely reacting to the anesthesia. But a woman obsessed with image died chasing a smaller flaw in the mirror. Here was a woman who had spent her life obsessed with image, with appearances, with face, and she died trying to fix her face. It was a banal, almost grotesque end for a woman who thought she was a Valkyrie. Even in death, Friederike caused a crisis. She had wanted to be buried at Taiti, the royal cemetery outside Athens, next to her husband Paul. The Greek government, now led by the socialists, was in a bind. They didn't want the Nazi queen back on Greek soil, even in a coffin. They feared riots. After tense negotiations, the government finally relented, but the permission came wrapped in a series of humiliating conditions. The family was granted a narrow window to fly in for the service, but they were strictly forbidden from spending a single night on Greek soil. The ceremony itself was stripped of all royal dignity. There would be no state funeral, no lying in state, and no flag draped over the coffin. Instead of mourning crowds, the event would be hermetically sealed by a police cordon, ensuring the queen was buried in total isolation. On February 12, 1981, Friederike returned to Greece for the last time. It was a cold, windy day. The family, Konstantin, Sofia, and Marie, stood by the open grave. Outside the palace gates, thousands of riot police held back a small crowd of royalist diehards who threw flowers. But the overwhelming mood in Athens was indifference. The monster was dead, the nightmare was over. As the earth covered her coffin, it wasn't just burying a woman. It was burying an idea. The idea that a monarch knows better than the people. The idea that a strong hand justifies a closed fist. Queen Friederike of Greece was a tragedy of her own making. She was a woman of immense talent, intelligence, and energy. In a different time or with a different upbringing, she might have been a great CEO or a formidable politician. But she was cursed by her context. She was a product of the German Empire's collapse, traumatized by the loss of status and radicalized by the authoritarianism of the 1930s. She brought the Nazi mechanism of control, the belief in hierarchy, the disdain for democracy, the obsession with purity, into a country that was yearning for freedom. She tried to save the Greek monarchy by making it strong. Instead, she made it brittle. She tried to protect her son by controlling him. Instead, she rendered him incapable of ruling. She tried to destroy her enemies by manipulating the system. Instead, she destroyed the system itself. Her life serves as a brutal historical lesson. It is a lesson about the toxicity of the mother-in-law state, the government that treats its citizens like children who must be disciplined, rather than adults who must be respected. Friederike wanted to be remembered as a queen of iron. History remembers her as a queen of rust, corrosive, outdated, and ultimately crumbled into dust.
In the end, she proved the oldest rule of power. You cannot force a people to love you. You can only force them to fear you.